Hi guys, I am back. I took a hiatus and it ended up being longer than I thought it was going to be. I have not uploaded a video in over a year, which is crazy. But my mental health was not doing so great and I was hating the place I was living, which was most of why my mental health was not doing good. I'll probably do an update, like a life update eventually. But we moved, I think you can tell by the background, and things are going better for right now. So I'm back to film another video. I'm gonna apologize in advance because you're probably gonna hear me yelling at my door throughout this video from Buttons. But if I let him in here, he's gonna just cause a ruckus, so we're not gonna do that. Or the ferrets, you might hear them in the background. But today's video, I'm gonna be talking about my history of growing up religious, specifically growing up Christian, and how that has led to where we are today, where I don't really identify as religious, which is something that I never thought that I would say. And I hope this video helps like other queer people grow up with religious trauma. Just helps kind of bring my story forward. I do have to give a couple of trigger warnings. So we are going to talk about racism, homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, some brief mentions of essay and kind of things like that. So I apologize if any of that's triggering. Feel free to skip this video if it is, because your mental health is more important. We're gonna get into it. I'm gonna break it down into like some general information about the religion. I'm not an expert by any means, kind of going off of my personal experiences and the little bit of research that I did do before this video. And then I'm gonna talk about like my parents' history and how that leads into mine and where that leads us to today. So let's get into it. So I grew up a Southern Baptist, which I think you can tell by my voice. I'm not Southern. I've never lived in the South a day in my life. But I actually didn't realize before filming this video that Southern Baptism is apparently, or Southern Baptist is the most common Protestant and Baptist denomination of Christianity. There's lots of different denominations. Southern Baptist exists solely because of the issue of slavery. Back in the 1800s, they wanted to have slaves. Regular Baptists didn't. They broke away. They created Southern Baptist. It is a huge denomination. There are so many members. And I'm going to get into a couple of the like core beliefs and what they are very against, because I think that'll give you an outline of like how that had an effect on me growing up. So let's get into it. They are very right-wing conservative denomination, as I think you could expect. They're very much anti, very homophobic, very transphobic. They do not support gay marriage. They do not support transgender people. Kind of the belief of you are born the way God created you. God does not just create trans people. He doesn't create gay people. So you are committing a sin against him and you're going to go to hell, basically. As far as racism goes, racism is still very prominent as well in the religion. Some churches are very like segregated of just being like white only. Some don't specifically say that, but they do like kind of are very judgmental when people of color come into their churches. A lot of them will kind of, you know, give dirty looks and say really awful things. So I feel like lots of white-only experiences that I grew up with specifically, because our church did not have very many people of color at all personally, but that is a really common thing in Southern Baptism. Misogyny, very prevalent. They like to claim that like they are equal, women and men are equal, but like they were created for different purposes, like based on like Adam and Eve, that God created Adam and then he created Eve to like support Adam. And that is kind of why the misogyny exists, because they are very much not treated equal. Women are not to hold a like power position in the church. They cannot be pastors. They are to kind of be like a pastor's wife or a wife of a member. They are to like have kids, be a homemaker kind of thing. Like they can work a job in most modern churches. Some are obviously going to be more old-fashioned on that. Typically they can work a job, but they still are to oftentimes look to work in the church. They just can't be, you know, the highest power of the church, support their husbands, have the kids kind of thing. Some are stricter on birth control than others. Some are very strict in the sense of kind of being quiverful. Quiverful is basically the belief that God will allow you to have as many children as he deems fit for you, and you will not use any birth control. People like the Duggars believe in this. Just want to make it clear, they're not Southern Baptists, they are fundamentalists, but some of those beliefs kind of carry over. However, a lot of them are a little bit more lax and do allow birth control. It just depends. Some deem birth control as abortion, which they are against, which, fun fact in researching this, apparently until the 70s when Roe v. Wade was happening, they were actually very pro-choice, and then they all became very pro-life. Some are worse than others. Some do allow it for cases of like sexual assault or incest. Some do not. It really depends. But purity culture, modesty culture are big things for women. They kind of claim that it's good for both, that it's like equal between both, but it's very much not true. It's very much put on the women to be modestly dressed. You're to go to church looking nice. Some churches are specific that they want women in dresses and skirts. A lot of them are modern and will allow like pants and stuff like that. But either way, you are to be modest. And purity is like, basically usually is a vow of purity, which usually teenage girls are encouraged to do this, of going in front of the church and basically making a vow to be a virgin until marriage. Some get purity rings. It really just depends, but purity and virginity are seen as like a huge thing. I think as you can tell by my hand signals, I don't very much believe in any of that, especially virginity. It's very much a social construct, but very big thing in the church, and very much held to the standard, unfortunately, too, with sexual assault or things like that. If that happens, that is kind of the woman's fault because she tempted the man into it, very much putting the blame on the victim rather than the perpetrator, which is really gross, which unfortunately has led to a very high amount of cases of sexual assault in Southern Baptist churches, whether it be from pastors, whether it be from parents. That's another thing. A lot of this, too, doesn't always come from the pastors, although a lot of it does. A lot of it also comes from the families. A lot of times, you know, these men and these families are being raised, being taught that they are like the highest power other than God. They are to like live up to God. You know, they can hold the power, the women can't. So a lot of times this results in abuse in households, results in like assault, unfortunately. I'll get into more of my personal experiences with a lot of that stuff later, but very prevalent. Let's see, tattoos, piercings, all are big things. Very much not a thing you should do because you're not to mark your body. That is God's decision to make for you. And so that's not something you should do. I'd like slightly trigger warning for self-harm, but I used to self-harm as a teenager, and that was something too, that was a huge deal. I'll get more into that later, but that is another thing that is deemed as like, help the person, but also kind of guilt them because they're not supposed to be leaving marks on them. That's like sinful, basically, which is really disgusting. And that also leads me to the topic, which I also forgot to give a trigger warning for, of suicide. I'll keep this brief, but I've heard a lot of cases of people committing suicide, unfortunately, and a lot of people in the church being like, that's so sad. But also they just committed the worst sin and they're now going to have to be judged for that by God, because God is the only one who can decide to take a life. You cannot take your own. Again, very disgusting, very manipulative, very victim blamey, just really gross. Some of the other things that they don't believe in are things like drugs, alcohol, cigarettes. Alcohol and cigarettes are really big ones. Alcohol has always been kind of random to me because in the Bible, it literally says that like Jesus turned water into wine. As much as I don't really believe in the Bible very much, I don't read it, I don't practice it. It is like a thing written down. Southern Baptists are very much against that. We'll talk about communion later, but when communion happens, it's typically done with like red wine. Southern Baptist churches strictly use grape juice. It's a very big thing. So very much anti all that stuff. An actual little slight like tidbit on my life is that back when I was a teenager and I was 17, my dad had a heart attack, and it was mostly due to smoking. My dad has been a smoker for like my entire life, basically. And he had to have a pastor friend that he had been friends with for years. He was the man who married my parents, like best friends. And he didn't even know my dad smoked until he came to visit my dad in the hospital. because that's how much of a secret my dad kept it, because that is so how, like, stigmatized it is. It's not seen as, like, let's help the person, like, it is, but it's more like, let's guilt this person, because it's not something they should be doing, and it's sinful, and it's, like, bad, basically. So those are some of the things that they're very anti-against. Oh, another thing is dancing before marriage. So most Southern Baptists are pretty cool with, like, you can go on dates. Obviously, as a single person, you can, like, kiss. It's not anything, again, sorry to compare this to the Duggars. It's the only thing I know to compare it to. It's not really strict like that, of where you can't kiss before marriage, you can't hug before marriage, stuff like that. You have to have a courtship. A lot of them are more lax on that. But one of the things that's always been kind of random is you are not allowed to dance if you are a single person. It doesn't matter if you have feelings for the other person, but if you're dancing with someone of the opposite sex, because, you know, gay people don't exist, that's a sin. You're not supposed to do that ever. That's something to save for marriage, whether it's like slow dancing, anything. Like, you do not do it. Always a weird rule to me, very oddly specific, but that is something that they are against. Some of the things that are beliefs that they have, I think number one, very common, is baptism. Baptism is basically the act of being, like, submerged in water for like a couple seconds to a minute. It's usually done by a pastor. They usually will read some sort of, like, religious text during it, or kind of recite something. I don't remember what it was. It's been a while for me. But typically they will do that. And the idea is you're putting your trust into God, that he's, like, going to protect you. You're being, like, washed in his blood and made, like, pure. And after you get baptized, that is basically the thing that, like, gets you into heaven. Like, you obviously have to pair that with still going to church, still practicing all the beliefs. But baptism is the main thing, that until you get baptized, you will basically go to hell, but once you get baptized, you will not automatically go to heaven. And that kind of goes hand in hand with, like, the idea of, like, the rapture, judgment day, which is talked about in Revelations, of the idea that if you are saved, the rapture is basically a belief that, like, one day Jesus will come back to earth. And when he comes back to earth, everybody who is saved, who is baptized, will immediately go to heaven. They will leave all their worldly possessions, so, like, clothes, anything, behind. But anybody who wasn't, or who was a non-believer, would automatically be, like, burned in hell. They will live on earth, which is going to be hell, and they will just live an eternity of, like, pain and suffering. And that's kind of what they use to sort of guilt trip a lot of people into believing, into converting, into getting baptized, any of that kind of stuff. It's very much a lot of guilt, I think, that goes with religion, specifically Christianity, because that's the experience I can speak on. And that's kind of what keeps you in place and keeps you as a good Christian and stuff like that. And the baptism is, like, meant to kind of say that, like, you're going to always put that onto God's hands. Like, you are still ultimately going to be a sinner, because no human's perfect, but it means that when you do sin, you'll ask God for forgiveness, and he will forgive you, and you will, like, move on and not do it again, kind of thing. Prayer, hymns, those are all things that are parts of church. So I think we all know what prayer is. I don't need to explain that. Hymns are just, like, songs out of a hymn book, which are kept in churches, like in the pews of the church, and you kind of will follow along and sing, and it's usually, you know, religious songs, basically. And then, let's see, what else? Offerings. Offerings are basically giving money to a church, essentially. So I specifically remember, the way my church was set up is every Sunday when we would have, like, our sermon service, where the pastor talks about the sermon, and it typically relates to something from the Bible to outside life of whatever the topic is that week. They will go around and pass around an offering dish, and you are encouraged to give money to the church as an adult. And I've always had lots of problems with this, because first of all, the money is going to the church. It's not going to God himself. They like to kind of add, like, obviously they're pretty transparent that it's going to the church, but it's also kind of believed, like, that's going towards God, because churches are where you worship God. And it's just really bad. There's a huge problem too in a lot of Southern Baptist churches, and I'm sure in a lot of churches, of pastors embezzling the money. I've personally dealt with that a lot, and I'll get into that more later. So it's very guilt trippy. It's very gross. And you hear a lot of stories too of people who are maybe homeless or very, very, like, poor, destitute, and they will give like their life savings, any money they have, to the church. And that will kind of be like glorified, like romanticized, sort of like they gave it all, you know, they gave all they had. And it's like there's nothing glamorous about not having a shelter, not having money to eat. Like, you don't owe a church money just for going. You can feel close to God outside of church in your own home. You don't have to go to a special place, and you don't have to give money to them by any means. But a lot of times they want you to think that. Let's see. The Bible, obviously, I don't really think I need to touch on that too hard, but the Bible is a huge deal in churches in Southern Baptism. I want to say specifically Southern Baptists read like the New King James Version. I could not tell you what that means. It's just a different translation, which is one of the problems I have with the Bible, which is why I don't really listen to it much. It's very old. It's very outdated. It's very mistranslated. It has been translated so many times to so many different languages. And a lot of times it's white men translating it. A lot of times white men have changed pieces of it to fit an agenda, such as, I know it used to say in the Bible, man shall not lie with boy, relating to pedophilia. It's been translated to say man shall not lie with man, to be homophobic. There's a lot of speculation that that was changed by random white man back in like the 40s, 50s, to be homophobic, basically. So I have a lot of problems with it. I also just firmly have the belief that a piece of like paper or a book should not be worth more than a human life. Like, if a piece of paper, anything you're reading, is gonna make you hate gay people, want to commit crimes, make you want to discriminate against people for being gay or trans or a different race or a woman or a different religion even, it's a book. That's a person. I think the person's more important than the book. So I have a lot of issues with that. That was kind of one of my first issues leaving Christianity and not being religious. I'll get into that more later. Let's see. Communion is another big thing. Communion is kind of, this one I'm not as great with knowing, but it's this act basically that they will do certain Sundays of passing around some sort of bread. We would use like oyster crackers and then little cups of grape juice in this case. The bread was supposed to signify God's body, and the drink was supposed to signify his blood. Feels very weird, feels very like probably came from some sort of pagan belief. It's just kind of strange with all the other things they believe. I don't think it's strange by itself, but with all the other things that Christians believe and how they are so anti, like paganism, Satanism, anything like that, and even other religions, I just don't think that. That's just really random and weird. It's always been weird to me, and I cannot for the life of me really remember why it's a huge thing, because I'm a bad Christian, so sorry. But that's a big belief. The way churches are typically set up that I would remember going to is you would go on Sunday mornings, pretty early in the morning, dress nicely, look presentable, and you would go, if you were a kid, you'd go to Sunday school. Sunday school was like taught by some sort of like elder of the church. It was usually a woman, typically not men very often, because they were pastors, you know, they were busy doing other important things. So they would typically give like Bible stories, things like that, but they would make it like more fun for kids. So things like doing like arts and crafts, listening to like music that was specially made to help kids like learn about it, reading like picture book versions of the Bible, things like that sort of. And it made it really like fun when you're a kid, but it's really very much like brainwashy. A lot of it is brainwashy, but I remember having a good time as a kid. Like, I enjoyed it. And then the adults during that time will have their own Sunday service. They'll catch up. They'll talk about the Bible. They'll talk about things going on in their life. It's kind of like a free period to share, have some coffee, kind of catch up, talk about things. And then afterwards, everybody will gather in the actual like church area where like the pews are and stuff, and the podium for the pastor. He will lead you through prayers, through hymns, and then they will talk about whatever the sermon is. Typically the sermon is something relating to something going on in the outside world. So if like an election's about to happen, it could have something to do with politics. It could have something to do with like loving your wife, loving your neighbor. It could have something to do with the 10 Commandments relating to real life. Like, it could be anything. It could have something to do with talking about the end times of like Revelations. It really just depends on what the sermon is that day, and it varies. And then you basically go home. Typically Wednesdays they'd have like youth group for like teenagers and stuff, or they'd have like adult study groups. but that's kind of how the church system was set up. Missions are another big thing. Missions are acts where people called missionaries will go to typically other countries and try to convert people to Christianity. A lot of times they'll use like they'll go to areas that have been hit by a famine or a drought or going through like a natural disaster or something, and they'll use that to try to convert people, saying like, well, you know, God will protect you if you believe in him, so that's why you need to convert, and he'll help you guys through this. And it's just really disgusting, really awful. It's very much like white savior complex for sure. There's also like smaller like missions. They're not really missions, but things that happen more in the in your neighborhood or maybe just a state over. Or typically people will try to like recruit members of the church. Sometimes they'll go door to door to try to talk people into coming to hearing about the service. Stuff like that, basically, that the church will do. Typically, pastors will do that in the area, but pastors' wives are encouraged, especially with missions. Women are encouraged to go on missions a lot more modernly. So all kinds of stuff like that. I'm sure there's things I'm forgetting about beliefs or non-beliefs, but I'll probably get into those as I give more history. So let's get into history, my personal history. So both of my parents are religious now. So I'll start with my dad's side. My dad's mom and dad, so my grandma. My grandma grew up, she's the only one out of us that's actually Southern. The rest of us are all from like Illinois. My grandpa was from Ohio. She grew up in Kentucky. She grew up very religious. It was a very important part of her life. She's always been a part of it. As young as I can remember, I remember her teaching me in Sunday school, reading the Bible to me, like all that kind of stuff. Very heavy part of her life. Her husband, my grandpa, he did not grow up religious. He actually grew up living kind of a hard life. His dad was like very abusive. He grew up in a really big family. He dealt with a lot of like problems with addiction and getting into fights and just getting in a lot of trouble as a kid. And he actually later on ended up in prison before he met my grandma. And in prison was when he converted, he changed, he eventually got baptized, and he would go to church with my grandma. After they got married, they were both religious. They would go all the time. My dad was one of 3 kids. Him and his brothers would always go to church. They sang in the choir. They were very much a part of their local church, very much active in the church. And later on, my dad would become a deacon. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, I don't really know what the difference is between a deacon and a pastor. The only main difference I know is that pastors actually, at least in Southern Baptists, have to go to a religious institute and get a degree. That's why my dad didn't do that, because he didn't want to. So typically, deacons aren't, but they can still give like sermons, they can still help out in the church, but the pastor is like the one in charge. They're in charge of like planning everything. They're in charge of financing the church, keeping memberships like going, all that kind of stuff. They're like the boss of the church. Deacons are a little bit under them, but they still have some of the same responsibilities, and that's what my dad did. Now, my mom, on the other hand, did not really grow up super religious. She grew up Lutheran, which in a lot of Southern Baptist settings and even Baptist settings, that is seen as a very liberal denomination of Christianity. My mom was baptized as a baby, which is a huge thing that Southern Baptists are against, because they believe that you can't make that decision until you are like a child or a teenager or an adult, which I do kind of agree with, that, you know, you shouldn't be forcing it on a baby. So my mom was baptized as a baby, but when she met my dad and they got serious and they got ready to get married, she converted, she got rebaptized, and she became a part of his church. She converted to Southern Baptist. So I was born into that. I've been going to church for as long as I can remember. Like, some of my earliest memories are going to a church, basically. And I remember, like, going to Sunday school, having a good time, all that stuff. Sitting through sermons, being really bored as a kid. Like, my mom would bring me, like, paper and stuff to draw, to keep me busy, because it was boring for me as a kid. I remember getting, like, a picture book, like a child's version of a Bible as a kid, and not reading it because I didn't want to. So that was a huge part of my life. By the time that I was born, my dad was not practicing like as a pastor or a deacon anymore. We were just members of a church, but my dad was still very much, you know, into it. My mom was. We were members of like one church for a very long time. Like, I think from the time that I was like a kid, like probably 6 or 7, to the time that I was like 10 or 11, we were part of this church. So for a while, I had lots of friends at the church. I got along with a lot of people. And then eventually the church started converting to sort of a different, like, teachings, and my dad was against it, so we left the church and then kind of looked around other churches. I forgot to mention, I was baptized in this church too. I was baptized when I was 10, I believe. And it was a huge deal for my dad that I had finally made that decision for myself to finally take, like, God into my heart and all that kind of stuff and blah, blah, blah. And I got baptized and I had, like, a whole baptism party. I got, like, a pink Bible that had my name engraved into it, my dead name engraved into it. Like, it was a huge, huge deal for me. And I just was kind of there. I didn't really care that much about the religion or, like, about the Bible really that much. I was just kind of there. A lot of times as I started getting older and I was supposed to start paying attention in sermons, my dad would, like, after church kind of quiz me on things that I was learning, and a lot of the times I'd get stressed because I didn't remember or I wasn't paying attention, because that's just not how I work. As a human being, I'm not going to be able to remember things from a lecture super great in any capacity, and especially not when something I'm not interested in, so I didn't enjoy that at all. But after we left that church, we went to another for quite a while. Also, I'm realizing this is something that's probably something important to bring up to show my religious background. Normally, I would not be just revealing my dead name, because a lot of people, especially around me currently in life, don't even know my dead name. But I am comfortable enough for this video. My dead name is Faith. That is my birth name. And so, yeah, religion, pretty important part of life. I don't know. I just feel like it's a little weird giving your kid some kind of name like that, because it's just like forcing it upon you that there's no other choice. You are going to grow up in this religion, and that's just the end of it. And that was another huge reason for me to change my name. Obviously, transitioning was the biggest. But I think even if I hadn't figured that out for a longer time, I probably still would have ended up going by something else, because I just didn't, it didn't fit me. I didn't think that way anymore as I got older, and I was just like, this is just, like, weird and I don't like it. So, yeah. But that's my dead name, so fun little fact for you guys. But yeah, I just remember growing up as a kid and it being fun, and then as I got to be a teenager and we started going to other churches, it became not fun and way more serious, of guilt tripping, like, you're gonna go to hell, you're sinning. And that was something I was constantly told growing up, is like, you are sinning, you're sinning. That was something that my dad constantly used against me to guilt trip me. It could be over the tiniest things, and he would make up things that were so, like, minuscule, like, what, like, this isn't even a recognized thing that Southern Baptists believe, but my dad would make it into, like, you're sinning conversation. So let me think of some examples. As I became a teenager, to help with my anxiety, I started kind of wanting to get into doing yoga and meditation. Nothing super serious, just, like, kind of in the pastimes. My dad was very against that. He was like, that is, like, new age enlightenment stuff. You are not going to do that because we don't believe in that kind of thing. And I was just like, I'm just doing it for my anxiety. And he was like, put your anxiety in God's hands. God will help you. And I was like, well, God hasn't helped me yet. I'm still anxious and depressed. I went through a really bad time with my mental health as a teenager, which I've shared before in, like, my coming out video. But I was not doing well as a teenager, and this time we weren't going to church regularly, and a lot of times my dad would try to connect that to why I was not doing good mentally, of like, it's because we're not going to church, that's why you're depressed, that's why you're anxious, and we're sinning, and we need to get back into church so you can be raised right, kind of thing. Really, really disgusting stuff. Going to church the couple of times that we would go, we'd go on, like, holidays, sometimes to more, like, random churches, never really helped me at all. So again, it just didn't help me. On sort of a darker note of more of my religious, like, trauma aspects of it, I grew up in a very abusive household. It was mostly my dad. My dad was very, not physically, but very emotionally, mentally abusive. I would often get ridiculed. I'd get bullied. I would get yelled at. My dad was kind of the person where I didn't know what figure I was coming home to, if I was coming home to a happy, lighthearted dad, or if I was coming home to a dad who was going to snap and scream at me randomly for something. He was very much dealing with his own problems, a lot of probably undiagnosed mental health problems, addiction. My dad was an alcoholic. He used to smoke pretty regularly. When he was younger, he had some issues with drugs. None of that is an issue by itself. The ways that he handled it, he tried to, go to church, kind of pray it away, kind of push under the rug. He will never ever say that he was an alcoholic, but he 100% was. I don't talk to him anymore. We'll get into that in a little bit, but yeah, very much that kind of thing. I remember for a while as a teenager, I started getting into theater when I was in high school. It was a huge thing for me. And a lot of times I'd get guilt tripped because some Sundays when we get close to shows, I would have to go for a rehearsal on a Sunday. And he'd be like, this is why we can't go to church. I'd be like, we didn't go to church to begin with. So why are you blaming me for that? I don't care. You want to go to church? You freaking figure it out. Why do I have to figure it out? I get yelled at for not reading the Bible or not practicing things. I get yelled at for wearing too much makeup. I wanted to get piercings when I became an adult because I wasn't allowed to have them as a teenager. I get yelled at about that. Wanting to dye my hair colors that weren't natural, I get yelled at about that. Wanting to have tattoos someday, all things that were part of who I was, automatically pushed down. I was openly told as a child or a teenager, my parents would always tell me, there is nothing that you could do that would make us stop, loving you, disown you, kick you out of the house, unless you came home and you were gay. That is the one thing. My dad literally would openly be like, it's okay if you were, a teen mom. I would obviously, lecture you and stuff, but I would support you and we would raise the baby because obviously abortion was not an option in this. But if you ever came home gay, that would be a different story. And that leads us into when I was in freshman year of high school, I got caught dating a girl and I got severely grounded and I almost got kicked out of my house. I literally had all of my belongings taken away besides a Bible that my dad was go read. I literally remember the day it happened, going in my room, sobbing, crying, hyperventilating, having the worst panic attack of my life, horrible. And just reading this Bible, this was supposed to magically help me or cure me. And my dad just basically saying, you need to fix this or you're gonna go to hell. This is disgusting. Literally calling me an abomination. I think a lot of Christianity wants you to believe that it's all sunshines and rainbows, but a lot of it is guilt, manipulation, brainwashing, and very much judgment. The most judgmental people I have ever met are from churches, 100%. And my dad was definitely one of those. So I remember just hiding it deep down after that. I would have gotten kicked out, but I was only 14 at the time. Legally, he couldn't do that. But I remember having to basically apologize to him and gain his trust back. And he didn't talk to me for a week straight, literally didn't acknowledge my existence, which is just disgusting to ever treat your child like that. And then I eventually went back in the closet. It was a whole thing. I've talked about this in my coming out video. I did not come out as trans until I was already 18 and about to leave, basically, because that just wasn't an option at all. But very much getting a lot of that pushed on me and a lot of abuse pushed on me and just it never getting acknowledged. Even to this day, neither of my parents will acknowledge that my dad's behavior was abusive in any way, shape, or form. I have, unfortunately, a lot of trauma related to getting abused as a kid that has caused me a lot of problems in my relationships. And specifically, I don't want to get too deep into this because I may eventually make a video about this, but this is very hard for me to talk about even now. It's still something I'm dealing with in therapy. But I grew up in a household where sex was just never healthily displayed to me. So I grew up in church being told save your virginity till you're married and then lose it with your husband and then it's a beautiful gift and it's not sinful. I grew up in a household where that was the exact opposite. My dad very much had an addiction to pornography. Again, I don't want to get too deep into that, but unfortunately I had to know about that as a child. So I was getting two completely opposite ends of the spectrum and not a healthy example of it. And unfortunately it did lead to me getting essayed to some degree, not to the point of getting R-worded. That doesn't make it any less bad. It was very bad. But again, this is all things that the church pushes under the rug, hush hush, We don't talk about this. Men are perfect. What do you mean? You're crazy. Don't come forward about abuse. And that's why it's still so nice to see people coming forward. It's horrible, but it's so, like, liberating to kind of feel connected to people, unfortunately, out of this disgusting situation, but to know that it wasn't just you, because I've heard so many other familiar stories from people who grew up dealing with this kind of stuff and it just affecting them a lot. But yeah, like, I just always remember being told, like, very uncomfortable things about my body when I was going through puberty by my father, being told, like, oh, you know, if you weren't my daughter, I would date you, kind of thing. Very not things you should tell a child, very much trauma. And that's probably all I'm going to get into in that aspect, because it's a lot for me. But yeah, just a lot of stuff like that that is just not taken seriously at all. I definitely remember going to certain churches that we would go to a couple times. There was one that we went to kind of regularly after we stopped going to the one that I was, like, raised in and I got baptized in. We stopped going because the church, turns out the pastor was embezzling money. Shocker, crazy. We ended up, we were actually pretty serious about that church. And that church, actually, we were going to around the time that I'm like 11 or 12. And I almost got talked into doing a vow of purity in front of the church at the age of like 11 or 12 and getting a purity ring. And thankfully, I never fucking did that. And I'm glad that I didn't. Because just horrible. So I'm glad of that. Not to get, again, too personal, but virginity, sabbatical marriage was never a huge thing on my mind, I don't think, as I think it's pretty common for people not to. I mean, like, 100%, if that's something you want to do, go for it, but it should not be something that's forced upon others, and it should not be something that is guilt-tripped out of people who decide not to. So it definitely was not a healthy relationship at all with sex, sexuality, yourself at all. All of these things were things I had to learn as an adult later in life after I left it. I haven't really talked about this either in a video. It's sort of semi-related, but when I was 18, I was basically kicked out of the house. And I think one of those reasons, honestly, was because I was starting to become my own person with my own beliefs. By the time that I was like 13, 14 was when I started realizing that the things I was getting taught about, like, gay people, trans people, mostly gay people, I didn't really know a lot of trans people at that time, unfortunately. The representation didn't exist for me. I was like, this feels incorrect. Like, why are we hating on this? Like, this is not something I want to do. I had my first best friend who was pretty openly gay, and I started realizing at the time that I was, like, an ally. Turns out I was deep in the closet, but just not something to hate people for at all. That's literally against what Christianity is teaching, even though so many people do it. It's literally like, love thy neighbor, but we're not loving thy neighbor at all. We're judging them. And I just remember, like, really starting to realize that I didn't believe that anymore. And as I started getting older and I started realizing this more, and I actually came out for myself, realizing that I didn't believe in these things anymore, and I didn't want to follow this religion. Why am I following a religion that's hating me? I did go through a period of time where I was very much, like, still calling myself a Christian for a lot of my teenagerhood and young adulthood, but I was kind of being like, I'm against a lot of parts of the Bible. The Bible's been mistranslated. Like, in reality, religion is, like, Christianity and Southern Baptist is about, like, loving your neighbor and all that kind of stuff. And that's what I stand for. And I can be queer and be a Christian, which I 100% believe you can. Like, this isn't to be, like, a hate speech at all Christians. This is at my specific denomination for being horrible. But then eventually I was just like, I don't think I even want to be religious at all. And as I got to be an adult, I started forming my own opinions, started forming my own beliefs. They were very much against what I was being taught. And my dad didn't like that. So I got kicked out. And I don't talk to him anymore. And that's 100% fine for me, because that was something that really helped me talk to myself, talk to therapists, talk to friends, and realizing that as much as I did have this trauma, I could turn it into something good, and I could move past it and even not consider myself religious, which was something that I didn't ever think I would do, because even in my times where I was like, I don't really want to follow this religion anymore, I have that guilt from growing up where I was like, well, if I'm not religious, I'm gonna go to hell. Even though I don't believe that 100%, because if we follow that rule, anyone who believes in a different religion, are they going to hell? No, I don't even know if I believe hell and heaven are real. I hope there's an afterlife. I don't know if there is. I'm just a little human. I don't know. I hope there's something after we die. But honestly, I'm fine with not knowing. And that was something that took a huge step for me to be like, I'm fine with not knowing that. And I'm fine with not really believing in anything particular. I still personally believe in God. I do sometimes like pray or like talk to him, but I don't find myself ever formally doing it. I haven't been to a church in several years. I have no plans to go back to one. And I really don't find myself ever probably going back to any kind of organized religion. I came close a couple of times. Once was a few years back. There is a Baha'i temple up in Willamette, which is like about an hour, 2 hours away from Chicago. And the religion kind of boasts on being very much like love everybody, love every religion, like everybody is welcome. Looking into it more, they're very homophobic as well, unfortunately. Specifically, they're very transphobic, I should say, because they do believe in gay marriage and stuff, but they do not believe that trans people can like identify as the gender that they identify with unless they are like completely passing, they've had every single surgery, all that stuff. Otherwise, they are not recognized formally. Like in that sense, I would not be recognized formally as a man for how I present myself, for the fact that I haven't had any surgeries yet, like all of that stuff. And that's not something that I want to be a part of. And that made me step back and say, I don't know if I want to be a part of any organized religion anymore, because I have that trauma, I have that hesitation, and I respect lots of religions. I love learning about other religions, good and bad things, like 100%, but it's just not something that I can see myself. I also had a call, like kind of close call with kind of looking more into the Satanic Temple back a couple years ago. And dealing with feelings of wishing that I could be unbaptized, because one thing about baptism is no matter if you do leave the church, you stop believing in it, you cannot technically get like unbaptized. And as much as I kind of don't want to believe that, I kind of do believe that. But I've also used that to my advantage in becoming an adult. I, as an adult now, am very much a spiritual person, though I don't identify with a set religion. I meditate, I manifest, like I have a manifestation journal that I write in. I definitely believe in like crystals. I believe in a lot of these things because they have helped me as a person and they make me feel good, so I follow it. And in that sense, I have become very interested with paranormal things and with ghosts and learning about things like that. I do enjoy watching a lot of like haunted, like people exploring haunted places and learning the history about them and talking to ghosts and listening to, you know, mediums or psychics talk about those kinds of things. I'm very interested in that. Seeing tarot readings. I've done a Ouija board before. I very much enjoy those things. And in that sense, actually being baptized is kind of a benefit on my part, because a lot of times when you are exploring haunted places where there could be bad things, there are good ghosts, but there's also like demons, which I do firmly still believe in. There are demons. I believe you can get cursed. I believe in things like, I believe in possession, all that kind of stuff. And to kind of avoid that, they often recommend that when you go into these places, you bring some sort of safe item for you, something that is important to you. I used to bring a cross necklace, but it's really just something that is important to you, and it's usually some sort of like religious or spiritual item, something that is important to you. And I found out that since baptism, I'm very less likely to ever have an experience of getting possessed or getting cursed or something like that, having a bad experience with a demon, because I am baptized, not baptized. So I do kind of use that to my advantage, that I am sort of a safe item to take with you if you do go to a haunted place. And that's kind of cool. And so it's things like that that have helped me identify those good parts of my childhood, the traumatic parts, and sort of help me like realize them, move past them, like, and deal with them and become the person that I am today, which is just that I'm not really anything. I'm not an atheist. I do still believe in God. I still believe in like Satan or the devil or whatever, but I don't follow any strict beliefs. I don't know what happens to us when we die. I don't really personally think a lot of people are going to go to hell. I don't think it's based off of just getting baptized, that's what's going to get you into heaven. I think it's more of who you are as a person, if heaven's even real. But yeah, I'm not a religious person, and that was something that I never thought I'd be able to say. It's something that still a lot of my family doesn't even know. Like, my mom doesn't know that. I think she would literally have such an episode if she found that out, which I probably will eventually tell her, or like this somehow will make its way to her, which if it does, I'm sure we're gonna have way bigger issues to talk about than me not identifying as religious anymore. But for now, it's just, I'm comfortable with where I am. I have so much gotten over a lot of that guilt. Guilt is still a really huge thing for me, even not related to religious things. I am a very guilty person. I have a very strong conscience, and that is something that I've been trying to work through, because a lot of that guilt is things that it's not meant for. It's something I've worked through in therapy, and I'm still working through, and I probably will always be working through. But it has made huge steps for me to now not be identifying as religious, not being identifying with these things that were so hateful, because I cannot stand to live in a place that will not accept me for who I am. And that is the only thing I care about right now, is myself, the people I love, the things I love. That's what I care about. I care about, like, the things that make me feel better, meditating, like spirituality, mindfulness, like manifestation, like things like that. That is what I care about. I care about learning more about those things. I care about learning more about paranormal things. I care about learning about other religions. I still think it's very interesting, but it's not something that I want to identify with. And I think that I have become so much of a better person, and my mental health has improved so much since not identifying with that stuff anymore. Specifically relating back to the self-harm, I mentioned that I was going to talk about that more before. So when I was a teenager, I went through a lot of episodes of specifically cutting myself. And the first time I ever did it, I felt so much guilt that I literally told my mom the next day. I was sobbing, and I was so anxious and embarrassed and ashamed of myself. And my mom was just like, I love you. We need to tell your dad. My dad basically was like, yeah, I love you, but basically if you ever do that again, I'm gonna send you to a mental hospital because you're sinning against God, kind of thing. Like, let me make you feel guilty over this. Like, I had many suicidal thoughts as a teenager, and I was kind of always told the thing to, I guess, to prevent me from doing it, mostly that I was told was, well, that's the ultimate sin against God, so don't do that. And then my dad would be like, yeah, I went through mental health problems, but I never killed myself because of that. I was like, well, that doesn't really help. Could you just, like, tell me you love me and care about me, maybe? So yeah, I think religion is a huge thing, and it can be beautiful and amazing, and it can be horrible and awful, and you should not have to be in a religion just over guilt or what you were raised as or anything like that, because it doesn't fucking matter. What matters is, like, what makes you happy, what helps your mental health, what makes you feel secure. If religion is what that is, cool. If it's not, that's fine. And yeah, that's something that I just never thought that I'd ever get to, and that's kind of why I wanted to make this video and talk about it, because I think I've come a really long way, and I have a really long way to go. But yeah, I don't see myself ever really identifying with religion ever again, and that's amazing for me. So yeah, I think that's kind of all I had to say. If this reaches other people who have similar experiences, I would love to hear some experiences and talk about stuff in the comments. I really only have my own experiences from my own part of religion, but I'd love to hear from different denominations, different religions. How did that affect you? If you grew up like queer, you grew up being a minority in any sort of way, how did that affect you? Where are you now? How do you feel? Like, I really hope this starts some kind of conversation, because I think it's an important one to have, and it's not always comfortable, and you don't always have the answers, and that's okay to not have the answers. We don't have to. We're humans. We don't need to know. We can live for the moment. We can live for now. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this. I will try to get back to regular uploading. I have a lot of ideas in my brain right now that I need to kind of get put down into things. Next, I really probably will try to do some sort of like a chit chat. I kind of want to do something like an update on life because a lot has happened in the year that I've been gone, and sort of also maybe some sort of makeup tutorial kind of thing. I'll figure that out. I kind of also want to learn how to edit these so you're not just listening to me rambling and saying 50 million times or listening to buttons meowing at my door. But for now, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Please like, subscribe, comment down below. Let me know how you're doing, and I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.